Morning came quickly to Maplewood Heights, the kind of quiet suburban neighborhood in Canada where the air always felt crisp and honest, and where people lived inside routines that kept their lives steady, even when their hearts were anything but. Emma Carter woke before her alarm again, her body responding to a restlessness she didn't fully understand. She lay still for a moment, listening to the hum of the heater and the faint sounds of life outside, and she felt something she couldn't name pressing on her chest. She pushed the blankets aside and moved through her small but warm apartment, coffee brewing on the counter, running shoes waiting by the door, the usual morning rhythm she'd built to keep her emotions from spilling everywhere. But today, something inside her hesitated. She touched the doorknob and froze, not because of fear, but because she sensed the day was carrying a shift, a change she wasn't ready for but also couldn't avoid. It felt as if her life had been holding its breath for months, and this morning was finally the exhale. Across the hall, Daniel Hayes opened his door at almost the same second, because his routine was practically a religion. Coming from New York, he had grown used to a city where chaos lived in the air, and the only way to survive emotionally was to build stable rituals. He ran every morning at exactly 6, never skipped breakfast, never allowed himself to slow down long enough to feel things too deeply. But this morning, when he saw Emma standing at her door with her keys dangling loosely in her hand, something in his chest shifted off its axis. Daniel wasn't the type to pause, yet there he was, caught mid-stride, trying to understand a feeling that didn't match his usual morning numbness. Emma looked up when she sensed him there. She knew Daniel not well, but in the way you learn a person through months of quiet hallway passes, shared elevator rides, and the occasional polite conversation about packages or weather. He always seemed controlled, reserved, maybe even guarded. And yet, for reasons she could never quite explain, being near him made her heart race with a mix of curiosity and nervous warmth. Today, that feeling was stronger, almost like something in the universe had dialed up the volume between them. "Morning," Daniel said first, his voice softer than he meant it to be. He cleared his throat, slightly irritated, not at her, but at the unfamiliar gentleness in himself. "Morning," Emma replied, forcing herself to smile even though she knew it didn't hide the storm in her heart. She hoped he wouldn't notice. But Daniel wasn't blind. He noticed everything even when he pretended not to. They walked down the hallway together, both pretending the silence between them was normal. It wasn't. It felt heavy and warm and charged with something neither of them knew how to name. Emma kept stealing glances at him, wondering when he had become so easy to look at and so impossible to ignore. Daniel tried to look straight ahead, but he kept catching her in the corner of his vision, the way she pushed her hair behind her ear, the way she held her coffee with both hands like she needed its warmth to steady herself. It unsettled him, which made him walk faster, but for once, Emma didn't fall behind. When they stepped outside, the cool morning wind brushed against their cheeks, and the sun, rising slowly behind the buildings, turned everything gold. Emma felt the light hit her skin, and for a moment, her chest loosened, letting her breathe fully again. The world looked softer, almost like it was telling her something she couldn't yet hear. Daniel felt it too. The calm was unnerving, but also strangely comforting, like the morning itself was pushing him forward. And as they began walking toward the trail behind their building, both of them realized something important. This morning didn't feel like all the others. Emma tried to distract herself by focusing on the familiar rhythm of her steps, but the more she tried to push her thoughts aside, the more Daniel filled them. She barely understood why, but something about being near him reminded her of things she'd forgotten: hope, excitement, the possibility of connection after a long stretch of loneliness. She'd been through her own heartbreak, but unlike Daniel, she had never learned how to hide her emotions behind solid walls. She just tried to outrun them morning after morning, hoping they would fade with distance. They never did. Daniel walked with his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, silently fighting a battle he hadn't expected to be facing at 6 in the morning. Every part of him was trained to stay distant, to keep people at arm's length. His last relationship had ended in a way that drained him, left him wary of letting anyone get too close again. He wasn't afraid of being alone. He'd made peace with that. What he feared was getting attached to someone and then losing them all over again. It was easier not to feel anything. Or at least it had been until this morning, until Emma. They reached the park trail, lined with tall trees that swayed lightly in the cold breeze. The path stretched out before them like a quiet invitation, but neither of them rushed ahead. Instead, they slowed down naturally, as if their bodies understood something their minds hadn't caught up to yet. Emma wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, savoring the warmth, and Daniel watched the way her breath turned into tiny clouds in the cold air. He didn't know why it fascinated him, but it did. As they walked, Emma inhaled deeply, letting the familiar sense of pine and earth calm her. She needed that peace. Her life had been shifting lately, and she felt like she was standing in the middle of a bridge she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. She had moved to Maplewood Heights for a fresh start, but the truth was, she hadn't fully let go of the past she had tried to leave behind. And now, standing next to Daniel, someone whose quiet strength pulled at her, she felt both terrified and hopeful. Daniel noticed her silence and wondered what thoughts were racing behind her eyes. He wanted to ask if she was okay, but he didn't want to sound like he cared. Caring had cost him too much before. Still, something inside him pushed forward, nudging him to say something, anything to break the tension inside him. "You seem different today," he finally said, surprising even himself with how honest it sounded. Emma blinked, startled by his observation. "Different?" she asked softly. "Not in a bad way," he added quickly. "Just different." Emma looked ahead, her heartbeat picking up. "Maybe I'm just tired," she said, though they both knew it wasn't the whole truth. Daniel didn't push her. He simply nodded, letting the quiet settle again. But now it wasn't awkward silence. It was a silence that held meaning, something tender, something unspoken but undeniably present. As they reached the small wooden bridge that crossed over a shallow stream, Emma paused, watching the water shimmer under the rising sunlight. Daniel stopped beside her, and for a moment neither moved. They stood close enough to feel each other's warmth, yet far enough to keep the moment innocent. The world seemed to slow around them, leaving only the sound of the stream and the faint rustling of leaves above. Emma didn't know why, but in that moment, she felt a sudden urge to tell Daniel everything, to admit she felt lost, that she'd been struggling, that she didn't understand why his presence comforted her more than anything else. But she swallowed the words. This wasn't the time. Or maybe she was afraid of what might happen if she spoke too honestly. Daniel stood beside her, staring at the water, but thinking only of her. He wondered why she had hesitated at her door earlier, why her smile had looked like it was holding something fragile behind it. And in a rare moment of clarity, he realized he didn't want to keep walking alone anymore. He wanted something more. Not romance. Not yet. Just connection. A reason to look forward to mornings. But before either of them could speak, a sudden gust of cold wind rushed through the trees, breaking their moment. Emma took a small step back, forcing herself to breathe, and Daniel straightened, trying to regain the emotional distance he always kept. Yet the moment had changed them. They both felt it. Something had opened quietly and deeply. As they turned back toward the trail, neither knew what the day would bring. But both understood one truth. The morning had shifted something inside them. The routine they relied on had cracked open, revealing something neither expected: possibility. And though they didn't know it yet, this morning would be the beginning of a story they could never have planned. The moment Emma and Daniel stepped deeper into the park trail, the morning air felt heavier, as if the world around them sensed something unspoken building between them. The leaves rustled softly overhead, and the ground was damp from last night's cold rain, but neither of them paid much attention to the scenery. Instead, they were both trapped in their own thoughts, quietly battling feelings they weren't ready to admit. Emma tried to keep her steps light and steady, but she could feel her heartbeat racing for no logical reason, and every time she glanced at Daniel, she felt that strange warmth in her chest, the one she had been trying to ignore since they met in the hallway. Daniel kept his eyes forward, focused on the trail, as if concentrating on the path would keep his thoughts from spiraling into places he had avoided for months. He didn't want feelings, didn't want complications, didn't want the weight of another heartbreak pressing into his life again. But Emma's presence pushed past his walls in a quiet way that frightened him more than he would ever admit. They jogged for a short while, but it wasn't their usual pace. It was slower, uneven, filled with pauses that neither of them acknowledged. Emma's mind wandered back to the moment on the bridge. How peaceful it felt, how safe she'd felt standing next to him, and how quickly that feeling had disappeared when the wind shifted. It made her want to return to that moment, to understand why her chest had tightened with something like longing. Daniel's thoughts were just as tangled. He kept replaying the sound of Emma's soft breathing, the way her eyes seemed to hold 1,000 questions she never voiced, the way he felt something pulling him toward her even though his brain screamed at him to stay away. Eventually, Emma slowed down first, placing a hand on her knee as she tried to catch her breath. Not from running, but from the emotion she was trying to push down. "Can we walk for a minute?" she asked, her voice steady but gentle, carrying a tone that made Daniel stop instantly. He nodded without hesitation, surprised at how natural it felt to adjust to her pace. Normally, he hated changing his routine. But with Emma, the rules he lived by didn't feel as strict, and that scared him in a different way. They walked along the trail, their steps sinking unconsciously, and Emma felt something inside her soften. She wanted to talk, wanted to share something real, something honest, but she wasn't sure where to begin. Daniel didn't press her. He simply waited, sensing she needed space to gather her thoughts. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt meaningful, like a shared understanding neither of them needed to explain. Finally, after a long stretch of quiet, Emma stopped near a wooden bench beneath a massive oak tree whose branches spread like open arms above them. "Let's sit," she said softly, and Daniel followed without a word. The bench was cold, but the moment felt strangely warm. Emma stared at the ground for a few seconds, trying to decide whether she should speak or keep her feelings buried. But something about the morning, the silence, and Daniel's presence pushed the truth out of her. "Do you ever feel like your life is moving but your heart isn't?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly even though she tried to sound calm. Daniel looked at her, caught off guard by the raw honesty in her question. He opened his mouth then closed it, unsure how much he wanted to reveal. But then he sighed, realizing the wall he usually hid behind felt different this morning. Thinner, weaker, almost pointless. "Every day," he finally admitted, surprised by how relieved he felt saying it aloud. Emma turned to him, her eyes soft, curious, and full of quiet understanding. "Really?" she asked, not because she doubted him, but because she didn't expect him to open up so easily. Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the trees. "After everything I went through, I started living like feelings were dangerous," he said, and the moment the words left his mouth, he felt them hit him again. He had never said it so clearly before, never allowed himself to. Emma felt her heart tug toward him. Not out of pity but out of empathy, because she knew what it felt like to hide pain behind daily routines that tricked you into feeling okay. She leaned back slightly, letting her shoulders relax. "But they don't disappear," she said quietly, "even when we hide them." Her words were gentle but sharp, a truth he hadn't wanted to confront. Daniel looked at her, and in that moment he saw her differently. Not just as the neighbor he passed in the hallway, not just as the quiet woman who ran every morning, but as someone who carried her own set of invisible wounds. Someone who understood him without needing details. Someone who saw past the walls he didn't even realize he had built so high. He wanted to say something, anything. But just as he opened his mouth, his phone buzzed inside his pocket. The sound was loud in the silence, almost intrusive, slicing through the moment like a blade. Daniel's expression shifted instantly, his calm cracking into something more rigid, more unsettled. He pulled out his phone, expecting a work message or a reminder, but the moment he saw the name on the screen, his entire body froze. Emma watched the change, saw his eyes darken, saw his jaw tighten, and her heartbeat stumbled. She didn't know who it was yet, but she could feel the emotional punch it carried. Daniel stared at the name for a long moment. Long enough for Emma to understand that this message was more than just a simple text. It was someone from his past, someone who mattered, someone who still had emotional power over him. "What is it?" Emma finally asked, trying to keep her voice steady even though she felt a sting of fear in her chest. Daniel swallowed, struggling to form the words. "It's my ex," he said quietly, and the bench between them suddenly felt wider, colder, almost like a barrier. Emma felt something inside her sink, but she forced herself to stay calm, telling herself she had no right to feel jealous or betrayed. They weren't anything, not yet, not officially, not clearly. But the ache still settled deep, reminding her how fragile and unpredictable human connection could be. Daniel stared at the screen, reading the short message over and over. "Can we talk?" 3 words that reopened wounds he had tried so hard to forget. He didn't reply. He didn't even know if he wanted to. His mind raced. Memories, regrets, questions, all crashing into each other until the morning air felt suffocating. Emma sat beside him, watching his struggle, wanting to comfort him but afraid of crossing a line he wasn't ready to define. "Do you want to head back?" she asked carefully, not wanting to push him deeper into his thoughts but also not wanting to sit in silence while he spiraled. Daniel nodded, though he didn't speak, and they stood up slowly. The walk back felt completely different from the walk out. The air felt colder, the sky seemed duller, and every step echoed with unspoken tension. Emma tried to keep pace with him, but Daniel walked faster now, not out of purpose but out of panic, trying to outrun emotions he thought he had buried. She followed quietly, giving him space but staying close enough to offer silent support. Daniel's mind was a storm, and Emma could feel it even without hearing the details. By the time they reached the edge of the park, Emma felt like she was holding her breath. She didn't know what was going to happen, didn't know what the message meant to him, didn't know if the fragile connection they shared was about to crumble before it even had a chance to grow. Daniel stopped near a lamppost, running a hand through his hair, his breathing uneven. "I didn't expect this," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Emma stepped closer, gentle but firm. "Are you okay?" she asked, and though the question was simple, it carried layers of concern she couldn't hide. Daniel looked at her, his eyes conflicted. "I don't know," he admitted, and those 3 words felt heavier than anything he had said all morning. They continued walking toward their building, both wrapped in thoughts that pressed too deeply to ignore. Emma felt the weight of uncertainty settling over her, but she didn't let it break her. She knew life didn't always move cleanly. She knew people carried pasts they sometimes couldn't escape easily. Daniel felt a different weight, a battle between the pain of the past and the pull of something new forming between him and Emma. Neither of them said another word as they reached the apartment lobby, but everything they didn't say filled the space between them with tension, hope, fear, and the first signs of something real. And even though the morning had started with possibility, now it stood on the edge of a question neither of them was ready to answer. The walk back to the apartment building felt longer than usual, even though the distance hadn't changed, because every step between Emma and Daniel carried a new weight neither of them knew how to handle. The quiet that settled between them wasn't peaceful anymore. It was tense, heavy with questions and fears that floated in the cold morning air. When they reached the front door of the building, Daniel paused for a second, almost as if the moment itself was asking him to choose something, to say something, to decide the direction of the day, but he didn't speak. Emma stood beside him with her hands wrapped around her empty coffee cup, her heartbeat thudding with worry she had no right to feel yet couldn't stop. Daniel held the door open for her, and she stepped inside, her eyes lifting toward his face in a silent question she didn't know how to form. They walked through the lobby in silence, the sound of their footsteps echoing softly against the tiles, and the more they moved toward the elevator, the harder it became for Emma to ignore the ache building in her chest. She didn't want to lose whatever had begun forming between them, not before she even fully understood what it was. Daniel pressed the elevator button with a shaky hand he hoped she wouldn't notice, but Emma noticed everything. She saw the tension in his jaw, the unfocused look in his eyes, the way his shoulders were tight with the pressure of emotions he wasn't ready to face. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and when they stepped inside, the enclosed space made the silence feel even heavier, as if the walls themselves were waiting for one of them to break it. When the doors closed, Emma finally gathered enough courage to speak. "Do you still love her?" she asked quietly, the words leaving her mouth before she had time to second-guess them. She didn't say it with anger or jealousy. She said it with sincere curiosity, needing to understand what place she held in his confusing morning. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, and he turned to look at her with surprise in his eyes. She wasn't accusing him. She wasn't trying to trap him in an impossible decision. She simply wanted honesty, and he respected her too much to offer anything else. He swallowed hard, feeling the question settle heavily on his chest. "I don't know," he said. Finally, and the honesty in his voice was raw enough to tremble. Emma nodded slowly, accepting his answer even though it hurt. She didn't want him to lie. She didn't want him to chase her out of confusion. She only wanted clarity, and this was the only clarity he could give her. The elevator dinged, and they stepped onto their floor. The hallway bright with morning light but filled with emotional shadows that followed them to their doors. Emma reached her door first, but she didn't unlock it right away. She turned toward him again, gathering every piece of courage she had left. "I don't want to be a routine break," she said softly, her voice carrying honesty that cut through the quiet. "I want to be a choice." Daniel froze, her words hitting him with a force he didn't expect. He looked at her, really looked, seeing not just her warm eyes and calm expression but the strength it took for her to say something so vulnerable. He stepped closer, his expression softening in a way she had never seen before. "You already are," he said gently, and for a split second, the heaviness between them seemed to lift. His words weren't empty. He meant them. But they weren't enough, not yet, not fully, because the past still lived in the space between them. Emma nodded, but she didn't smile. The truth was too complicated for smiles. She reached for her door handle, hesitating for only a moment. "So what happens now?" she whispered, her hand still hovering near the lock. Daniel looked down at his phone, the unresolved message still glowing on the screen like a reminder he couldn't escape. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and met her eyes with a seriousness that made her heart clench. "Now," he said slowly, "I decide whether I'm running from my past or running toward you." Emma felt her throat tighten at his words, because they held something fragile and hopeful, something that could break or bloom depending on what he chose next. But she refused to put pressure on him, refused to stand there waiting for him to pick her like she was an option on a list. She stepped back gently, her voice soft but steady. "Take your time," she murmured. "And whatever you choose, make sure it's for you." With that, she unlocked her door, stepping inside with a final glance that carried every unspoken emotion between them. Daniel watched her disappear behind the door, and when it closed with a quiet click, he felt the entire morning crash into him at once. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes, trying to steady his breath. He felt torn down the middle, between the comfort of the familiar past and the delicate pull of the unknown future. His ex reaching out felt like a wound reopening. Emma stepping into his life felt like a door opening. And standing in the hallway, he felt the weight of the choice pressing on his chest. After a long moment, he pushed himself off the wall and walked into his apartment, the door closing behind him with a soft thud that echoed in the quiet. The room felt colder than usual, or maybe it was just him. He stared at the message again, reading it over and over, trying to understand why it shook him so deeply. It wasn't that he wanted his ex back. It wasn't that the past still held the same power over him. It was that he didn't trust himself to move forward without knowing why the past still had a voice in his life. Emma, on the other side of the hall, leaned against her door with her eyes closed, trying not to fall apart. She wasn't heartbroken, not yet, but she was afraid. Afraid that she had opened her heart too soon. Afraid that Daniel would choose safety over something new. Afraid that morning would become just another moment lost to confusion. She walked to her kitchen, made a fresh cup of coffee, and sat down at the small table by the window. She watched people heading to work, watched the sun climbing the sky, watched the world moving even as her heart stayed still. She told herself she wouldn't wait helplessly. She would keep living, keep moving, keep breathing. She wouldn't let fear decide her path. Meanwhile, Daniel paced through his apartment trying to think clearly. He sat on the couch, stood up, walked to the window, sat again. He felt like two different versions of himself were battling inside him, the one who wanted to protect himself from getting hurt again, and the one who felt something awakening every time he looked at Emma. He unlocked his phone again, reading the message one more time. "Can we talk?" His thumb hovered over the screen, but he didn't reply. Instead, he put the phone down, rubbed his face with both hands and whispered to himself, "What am I doing?" He thought about his ex, the memories, the hurt, the closure he never fully got. Then he thought about Emma, the quiet strength in her eyes, the vulnerability in her voice, the way she made the morning feel alive instead of routine. Hours passed. The sun shifted. The building grew louder as people moved through their day. And finally Daniel knew what he had to do. Not because someone pushed him, not because he felt pressured, but because clarity finally settled where confusion had lived all morning. He picked up his phone, not to reply to his ex, but to block the message from taking over his mind again. He didn't need to reopen that chapter to understand it was already closed. He needed to move forward. And moving forward meant knocking on Emma's door. He stood outside her apartment, heart pounding, unsure of what he would say but knowing he needed to say something. He raised his hand, hesitating only for a second. Then he knocked. Inside, Emma froze, her breath catching as she turned toward the door. And in that single moment, the entire direction of their lives began to shift. Quietly, gently, but powerfully. Because sometimes the hardest choices lead to the most unexpected beginnings.